let's start the webinar. So again, thanks in advance to our speakers, Alan Roberts and Boone Davis, who I will introduce shortly after this introduction. As you may already know, this webinar is one of several pieces of work that New Energy Update are doing to promote the development of the US offshore wind supply chain. Now, it's an exciting time for the US offshore wind industry, and I'd just like to put things into perspective for you. The US offshore wind industry boom is happening right now. The states of Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island alone have the potential for offshore wind deployment of between 4,000 and 8,000 megawatts by 2030. And with that, the creation of up to 36,000 jobs. So really, only the early movers are going to reap the rewards. So well done to all of you who are signing up to this webinar to find out a bit more about what the US offshore wind supply chain has to offer. I'd also like to point out that in conjunction with this webinar, we are running the US Offshore Wind Conference, which will be taking place in Boston on June the 7th and 8th. And that is all about securing investments, developing partnerships in the supply chain. So I would really strongly recommend that you all attend if you can. So that will take place on June the 7th and 8th at the Boston Park Plaza Hotel. Just a bit more about the conference. It will be happening for 2 days. You'll have the opportunity to attend to network with up to 1,000 executives. I'd like to point out that all of the US offshore wind leaseholders will be there. There will be around 60 plus speakers in 3 tracks and 30 plus exhibition booths to explore. There will be one dedicated track for oil and gas service companies that wish to learn about how to transition into the US offshore wind industry, similar to what we've got today. And basically that'll take you through the key markets, the upcoming projects and pipeline, the construction and installation processes, and hopefully so that you can all build a solid business plan to successfully enter the supply chain. And it's no doubt the largest and most successful meeting point for the US offshore wind industry. So we hope you can join us. I've actually added the brochure to the handouts, which you should be able to select in the webinar app. So take a look at the brochure after the webinar. Now, moving on to the webinar, I'd like to welcome and thank today's speakers. First up, we have Alan Roberts, Associate Director at BVG Associates, who will speak about the job impacts of offshore wind development and highlight the types of jobs that will be created. Second, we have Boone Davis, Principal Consultant at the Renewables Consulting Group. Boone's presentation will provide a current summary of the US offshore wind market and supply chain and identify opportunities for US oil and gas companies to participate. The webinar will last for approximately 60 minutes and it is being recorded, so I'll send you the recordings and the presentations in approximately 2 days' time via email, so watch out for that. Now, I want to bring your attention to the chat box application on your screen. If you have any questions for the speakers during the session, you can just put those in the box and I will be moderating those and allocate some of those to the speakers at the end of each presentation. And we'll try and answer as many questions as we can. So now I would like to hand you over to the first speaker, Alan Roberts. So I'm just going to share Alan's screen now. Over to you, Alan.
Good morning to you all, and thank you, Adam, for the introduction. I call my talk the Offshore Wind Revolution because I think that's quite apt. I think although there are some of us who have been involved in the industry for some years now, and myself, I'm in my 9th year, I think what's happened in the last 18 months has really taken everybody by surprise, and I think it really creates a huge opportunity and interest, not just in kind of markets such as Northern Europe and the US, but globally, and that'll be the thrust of my presentation. So just a quick word about BVG Associates, my company. We've been going about 10 years. We specialise in renewables, and a large emphasis of our work is in offshore wind. And in a way, we've sort of grown with the industry as it's developed in the UK and in Europe, helping clients really of all sizes, from technology startups to developers to multinationals, turbine manufacturers, right across the board, in a sense trying to help them sort of navigate their own route as the industry has grown. And that's involved advising on the market and how it's like to develop and where the opportunities lie. It can be trying to understand where the economic benefits are in terms of jobs, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Also in terms of cost modelling, understanding the future trajectories and where the future cost saving is going to come from, and in a sense helping companies position themselves for that future. And we also have a strong technical background, and we also provide quite detailed technical analysis for clients also. Although it's about half of our work is in the UK, so we have clients really across Europe, and the US is becoming more and more important for us, and I guess that's why I'm here today. So in terms of, there are three strands to what I'd like to talk about. First of all, I mentioned cost reduction right at the beginning, and that's really how I'd like to start. And then move on to the global significance of the cost reduction and in a sense what that might mean for you. And then move on to the business opportunity and where those may be for US companies, and in a sense how we see the US supply chain growing over the next decade or so. A lot of detail on this slide. But really, I'm going to go in not in detail. But this is really a story of two projects. The first one is the West Duddon Sands, which is a project on the west coast of the UK. They're both owned by Ørsted Energy, formerly Dong. So West Duddon Sands is a project. I think it's about 350 megawatts, kind of medium-sized project. At the bottom we have Borssele 1 and 2, which are also owned by Dong, Ørsted, in the Dutch waters. And you can see from that graph, it shows you the cost. I'm afraid it's in euros, but I think you can do a relatively quick translation conversion if you like. And you can see that in the period of from between those projects, which is about 6 years, there's quite a spectacular cost reduction. And in a sense, it's really interesting to understand where that comes from. So first at the top there, you can talk about site characteristics. You can see that actually the Borssele site is inherently more expensive. It's further from shore and in deeper water, so that creates additional costs. But you can see in all kinds of other areas where we see quite substantial cost reduction. The key ones I would pick out are turbine rating. West Duddon Sands uses 3.6 megawatt turbines, and Borssele 1 and 2 will use 8 megawatts. And then just in doing so, not by necessarily saving any money in terms of the turbine capex, makes a huge impact on terms of the amount of steel you need to put in the water, or the best you need to install it, and then the effort needing to go into maintain that. And that's quite a dramatic improvement, and we will continue to see that in the future. We also see huge developments in technology across the supply chain, from transmission in vessels, in terms of foundation technology also, and that's also making a huge impact. The other thing I'd really pick up is really in terms of what we put up experience there, both in terms of learning and risk reduction. Those are really quite important things, and they're very important as we look to take the industry more globally, as those things aren't necessarily easily translated, but you can see they make quite a spectacular impact on the cost of energy. And in a sense, this is one of the reasons why offshore wind was originally quite expensive. Was it was a large number of complex activities offshore, and doing this repeatedly created lots of risks and run-ons in terms of cost. But actually, the fact that it's a highly repeatable industry and lots of repeated processes right across the supply chain in itself has created a huge opportunity for cost reduction. And really, by optimizing those processes, both in all parts of the supply chain, marine contractors, turbine manufacturers, developers, right across the supply chain, and just continual learning from project to project has made quite a dramatic impact on cost. So that's, the second slide is the same data, but looking at it in a slightly different way, and it shows you where in the supply chain where those impacts are being felt. And I guess the one that really jumps out at you there is in the WACC, the waste annual average cost of capital. And in a sense, that's really quite a dramatic change in terms of the cost of capital we've seen, and I guess that partly reflects historically low cost of borrowing around the world, but also in terms of the lower risk that's perceived in offshore wind by lenders becoming quite an attractive option. So you can just see the cost of capital coming down there has been really quite a major impact on the cost. A few other things there I'd like to maybe draw attention to. The new turbines we're seeing offshore are more reliable. They're better at energy capture, so therefore the yields go up and the losses go down, and those are quite important. We're also seeing increases in the lifetime of the wind farms. Your typical onshore wind farm has a life of about 20 years. Turbines putting offshore now are more like 25 years, and the expectation is that in the next decade, the expected life for an offshore turbine will go to 30 years, and so that's an important part of, in a sense, lowering the cost for what is quite a capital-intensive industry. So I know Boone's got some information on the market. This is really give you a sense of how it's grown. Perhaps a little bit difficult to see from all the different colours there, but you'll get these slides. I guess just to pick out the point is that the UK is still a major part of the market, with Germany and Europe very important. China growing, but maybe China not growing as fast as some people originally thought. We've seen huge growth in the onshore industry in China, and to some extent the ambitions in China offshore haven't been met on quite the same speed, and I think that's an interesting lesson in terms of how you take the industry and transfer it to a new territory, that it's not quite as simple to do things as some people might think, and it's important, I think, for all people in the industry to sense where there is excellence and experience to make sure that that's captured, and in a sense China is very much doing things on its own. I want to talk about the global significance. I guess if you're reducing costs to a level where they require minimal or potentially no subsidy, we're already seeing some wind farms bidding in at zero for German projects, and we're expecting an auction in the new year in Holland where we're expecting zero bids in for new Dutch projects. I guess that partly reflects maybe power prices in Europe, which are maybe a little bit higher than those in the US, but still reflects an industry which expects to be able to compete without subsidy in at least in the middle part of next decade, and that's really, in a sense, makes a huge impact to the global opportunity. So what you've got here is a global map showing coastal wind speeds around the world, and in the sense there are some obvious things there. You can see, yes, here we are in Northern Europe, and it's pretty windy here, and you can see that the same is true also around the coast of China and around Taiwan, where there's also interest, and obviously around in the eastern coast of the US as well. The interesting thing here is if you start looking about where the opportunity lies in this slide, you see that actually the US really is such a large market, and really that's why it's become such a source of excitement, I think, for the industry as a whole. Here you can see the dark red bars, which are those areas, if you like, which are suitable for fixed foundations. Pretty much the state of the art now, and the lighter pink bars are what would needs to be developed using floating foundations, and that's very much an embryonic part of the industry. We're really just seeing a few demonstration projects with floating foundations now, but you can see there's obviously a huge opportunity in the US in particular for developing floating technologies for where you have a large parts of territorial waters outside 50 meters or deeper. So I guess the next stage in looking to see where those global markets might be is to essentially look at some other variables, and this is something we've been looking to do. So in the top left-hand corner, you've got the map we've just seen. But if you start looking at where the global population density is close to the coast, and that becomes quite important, where you have in certain areas of the world where you have weak transmission, then clearly having your energy supply close to the point of use becomes particularly important. And again, so you can sort of marry that up with the wind speed in global areas, you start to see where there's really going to be quite a strong demand for offshore wind. And at the same time, if you're looking at renewables, you need to understand where there's onshore wind resource and onshore solar resource, because obviously they would typically be cost competitive in some parts of the world. So in a sense, you need to understand what the competing technologies are there and understand where offshore wind might fit But actually, by putting that piece together, I think you can get a good sense of where the industry is growing. And probably the answers to that won't be any great surprises, but you'll see it's in the east coast of the US, in Northern Europe to a large extent still, Southeast Asia, and particularly where we see the industry is growing. But in a sense, looking beyond those areas to where floating technologies can be developed is maybe where we might be looking in maybe 10 years time or 15 years time, where we might see some big growth areas in the global deployment of offshore wind. So all of that clearly creates business opportunities, and now I just take a few minutes to talk about some piece of work we did for the multi-state project through the Clean Energy States Alliance. And what we try to do here is try and understand how the offshore wind industry might develop in the US and what that might mean in terms of jobs. So in the graph I've shown, these are two scenarios, an 8 gigawatts by 2030 scenario and a 4 gigawatts scenario by 2030. For those of you who are less familiar with the power sector, I guess 1 gigawatt is broadly equivalent to a thermal generation power station. So it's a reasonable chunk, but it's not going to make too much of a dent in the overall US generation portfolio. But it's a start, if you like. And it's interesting to see how you can see how you think industry might develop in each of those scenarios. Incidentally, I think probably where we are now, I think most people think that 4 gigawatts is unduly pessimistic, and most people will probably see the ambition in the US as edging up towards 8, and some will be more optimistic than that even. So, in a sense, it'd be reasonable to look to this higher scenario to get an understanding of how things might develop. So, first thing is to say, well, actually, if you want to know where the business opportunities, where do the costs fall? Lots of information on this slide, and I won't go through it. I'll just pick out a few things here. The first thing is, you see in the orange sector there, that's the turbine supply. So that's the single biggest package that will be awarded by the developer of the wind farm. And in a sense, it sets the tone and the design for what goes beyond. So in a sense, it's the single most important package that the developer will award. And in a sense, that defines essentially how the wind farm is built and maintained after that. It's very interesting. I know for those of you who've got a strong sort of offshore energy background, in a sense, it's to see the project from a very different way in terms of you've got to build a wind farm, but it's building infrastructure and then thinking in terms of you've got a platform there and you stick a turbine on the top. Actually, the way the industry thinks is very much the other way around. You think, well, what's the turbine that I'm going to put there, and then everything is built around that. Because the turbine is the most important thing in terms of the commercial decision made by the developer and the technology that's being employed. And in a sense, you will see very early in the US industry, you will see the turbine manufacturers very active, because those are the people who drive the industry. And in a sense, they're the people who have the biggest stake in making sure it works. And so you'll see them very active and very prominent in conferences and politically. Also important to point out that the big purple section here, which is the operations and maintenance. In a sense, this is where the long-term opportunities lie, and there's a great deal more certainty here. You know those wind farms are going to be there for 25 years or more once they've been built, and it's one of those slightly forgotten things that are in the rush to build wind farms, that a lot of the value is, and a lot of the jobs, the opportunities lie further down. But at the same time, they offer there's less risk attached, because you know those wind farms are going to be there. Whereas I think inevitable with a large capital industry such as offshore wind, there's inevitably a certain sort of bumpiness of the annual installed capacity, which can create problems for suppliers. And we've seen that in particular when we talked about foundation suppliers in Europe. We've seen a number of suppliers come into difficulty. They've vetted some to be competitive, but they found that their order book is pretty uneven, and that can cause strains on the companies themselves, and have to be restructured or in some case sold on. In terms of the way they're contracted, the preferred method for what you might call experienced utilities in Europe is very much to multi-contract, and so that can be, as well as awarding a single turbine package, is to award maybe even up to 15 packages in some cases. So you can see the little segments around here. Some developers will award those as individual packages. There is some trend or some preference in others to bundle these up to some extent. But in a sense, what we're seeing is that most of the developers that are experienced back themselves to manage the risks and interfaces there, and in a sense seek out best value in the supply chain. So I guess that's the way things have gone here. How that develops in the US will probably depend on to what extent those same developers have actually got to gain a foothold in the US. So we talked about how the supply chain might evolve in the US, and in a sense this is part of my analysis looking at different parts of the supply chain and seeing actually how do we think is it likely to happen in the US or not likely to happen in the US in those scenarios. So you're looking over to the right hand side, and you can see that the black shaded things are what we call baseline jobs, and that's what we're saying is that in those parts of the supply chain, they are things that you could need to be done locally, or there will be no plausible reason for going outside the US. And so clearly up at the top there you got project management development. Clearly the developers who are active in the US will be developing them from the US, and they'll use US contractors to do survey works and analyses. And so you would expect that to happen. And at the other end of the spectrum, back in the operations and maintenance, you can say, well, you can clearly expect that if you want to maintain a wind farm, you need to be close to it, and it'll clearly create those jobs locally to the wind farm. It's those bits in the middle where the picture is pictured a little bit more uncertain. And here, where you can see where the actual size of the market is really quite important in defining the likelihood in which those jobs will come to the US. We can say with some confidence that in even a medium scenario that big items like blades and towers are complex to move. They're large objects. You want to avoid double handling, and so clearly bringing those things from Europe as they were for the Block Island project is not really viable on a commercial scale project. So you can see that actually the tipping point for those kind of products is really quite low, and that certainly the market leaders, the most ambitious companies in those sectors, will be looking either to invest or to partner with the US companies to make sure that they're not suffering from any logistical penalty. Some things are more difficult, and I think Bruno will talk a little bit about this as well. Is the Jones Act, which I think is a major challenge in that in part some of the efficiency that have been gained in European offshore wind have been through the investment in dedicated bespoke vessels really designed for the sector, and they are operated by experienced and slick crews. In a sense, that's quite a challenge in saying, well, if we can't operate those vessels, what do we do, and how do we manage? And I guess that's something that the challenge needs to be overcome. And my guess is that in the short term, at least, the investment in a Jones Act vessel is maybe is a borderline commercial decision, and we may see some what you might call suboptimal solutions in the short term. And then since that's why we've seen there for sort of foundation installation, turbine installation, we're a little bit less confident that we're going to see that supply chain go to the US, partly because in the sense that the vessels that we understand are operating in the Jones Act compliant vessels in the US really aren't up to the job of installing 100 turbines for a commercial project, and that's quite a challenge to be overcome. So in terms of what that means in jobs, and so you can look at the report. I think it's available on the Clean Energy States Alliance website, or directly from the BVG Associates website. And this is how we built up the job picture from that analysis. And you can see that in the home market, clearly there's more jobs available, but also you can see that clearly you're much more likely to get them. And I think that's, in essence, demonstrates how important that the market is in actually sort of driving forward investment and creating opportunities in the US. In these early years, it's difficult. I think for all investors in the US, that the critical mass in these early part of the 2020s is going to be quite difficult. And so I think if developers are looking to keep costs down, then there will be a tendency to continue to use European suppliers. Hopefully in a sort of middle part of the 2020s, we'll see the industry reach critical mass, and that will trigger the investments, which will then create wider opportunities across the supply chain. A couple of extra points I'd like to make here is we've seen perhaps interest by certain states in maybe adopting slightly protectionist policies, and I think this is perhaps quite a dangerous thing to adopt. I think if you're looking at the US market as a whole, there may be a business case for investment, but as soon as you sort of start to to do it on a state-by-state basis, there almost certainly isn't. So there's a real risk that protectionist policies, I think, actually undermine any of the attractiveness of the US as a site for investment. And I think that would severely delay the development of the sector. The other point I'd make is what we've seen as the European supply chain has developed is actually the most successful of those that actually commit quite fully. The UK has a very successful oil and gas industry, but in a sense they haven't always been successful in identifying the opportunities in offshore wind. It's been something they've dipped into, looked at, and maybe don't quite look of, and they've just been out of it. And in a sense, we found that they've in a sense struggled to compete with maybe some other contractors, perhaps from the Dutch and Belgian dredging fleets, for example, who have in a sense committed more wholeheartedly to the sector and seen the long-term opportunities. And so that's really the advice that I would give, is that if you believe there's a good fit between what your company does, think of it as a long-term opportunity, think of it as a global industry that was developed, and think of it as one which is here to stay, and position yourself to make a major impact there. I think we sort of felt that people who are waiting for the wind farm on their doorstep so they can supply to it are those who aren't successful, and you need to be able to going out and being proactive and actually selling yourself to the whole of the industry rather than waiting for it to come to you. So that's what I want to cover. Just very quickly, we do have a presence in the US with Andy Geisbuehler, who's joined us recently. So we're available to help both from our UK office here and through me, but also with Andy, who'd be very interested in talking to you. For those who aren't used to the industry, please visit our website. We've been asked by many organisations to produce reports on the growth of the industry and the opportunities and the technologies and things. So there's a huge number of reports which I think many of you new to the industry might find useful. I think there's quite a library of resources there that go back a few years, which I think will be useful certainly for newcomers to the sector. So that's me. Thanks for the opportunity, and yes, if there are any questions sort of fed back through Adam, very happy to try and answer them.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alan, for a very insightful presentation. I just had a few questions to put to you. First is, what is the first practical step a company can make in entering the sector?
I think it goes a little bit back to that sort of point I was making a few minutes ago about committing, and I think it's I think if you're interested in going to the sector, that I think you have to do that early research in terms of what's happening, who's doing what, and learn to speak the language of the industry. In a sense, if you're not familiar with the terms and the technology and the terminology and the technology that's being used, I think that can already sort of send up red flags to people in the sector. So I think if you can try and understand the language and who are the important players, and I guess that will in a sense improve your credibility. I would also recommend going to the conferences. I mean, the one Adam talked about is an example, but also the AWARE conference. I would really recommend you attending those. You'll see a lot of interest from established suppliers in the sector, and it's a good opportunity to meet and talk to those people, and in a sense get a strong feel for the industry and understand what role you can play in it.
Okay, and where are the major US investments likely to be?
I think this is an interesting one. I mean, we've been doing quite a lot of work for a number of states in the East Coast and Northeast Coast, and I guess all of them are trying to understand where does the opportunity to lie for them. I think we'll see that there is a benefit in having investments close to the site of wind farms, but at the same time, we can see from most major components there may only be maybe one or two significant investments, and I guess what we're looking for is for states to make that not just that first mover status, but also provide that long-term clarity and confidence in their market. In a sense, it's that confidence that there is a long-term market in that area will encourage the investors to come in. And in a sense, there are inevitably to be challenges in terms of port sites, logistics, and all those kind of things. But actually, I think what the industry most values is actually having that long-term view of the market and a warm political welcome. And those are quite important in making sure there's the right places. So I can't tell you the right answer, but I can give you some of the ingredients. And I guess that this is the issue a lot of states are wrestling with now.
Okay, and one final question is, how much, I know you touched on the Jones Act, but could you tell us how much of a problem the Jones Act is likely to be?
I think in the short term it is a problem, and I think in the short term that the industry will need to find some compromises, and in the sense and in doing so it'll have to accept that its projects are more costly as a result. For many of those of you who are familiar with the Block Island project, where essentially we had the European jackup vessels stationed at the wind farm site, and with the components, with some components fed from shore, but with the main turbine components taken directly from Europe. That's not really a viable solution in the long term. But in the absence of a Jones Act compliant vessel, which might cost upwards of $200 million, that's a major investment in view of the market size that we've got over the next 7 or 8 years. So I'm expecting to see some pretty pragmatic solutions being sought to get the industry moving. And I think the important thing is that I talked about market certainty, but actually giving an investor the confidence to invest in a state-of-the-art Jones Act compliant vessel is an important part in making the industry competitive in the US. And actually the greater certainty there is, the sooner that will come. But in the short term, I think we're going to find some perhaps a little bit untidy and uncostly solutions, but that's just doing the best that people can. And I know there's a lot of interest in vessel conversions, and that might be part of the story. Dedicated feeder vessels may be part of the story, but in the sense that it's important to understand that those are probably compromises, and ultimately they won't deliver you the cost reductions that you want.
Okay. Well, I think that's those are the questions we've got time for Alan. So Alan, thank you very much for the presentation and for all of the info you've shared with us. Alan's presentation will be shared again after the webinar, so watch out for that. Now I'm just going to share with you Boone Davis's screen, Boone Davis from the Renewables Consulting Group, so just bear with me while I switch over. Right, so over to you, Boone.
Thank you very much, Adam and Alan, for the great sort of introduction to the topic of offshore wind and the U.S. market and where we sort of stand. So my name is Boone Davis. I work for a company called the Renewables Consulting Group, or RCG, and I'm here to present about sort of a little bit more of a bottoms-up kind of approach to U.S. project and supply chain development. Just to give you all a sense of my background, I've been involved in the first 2 sort of major offshore wind developments here in the U.S. I was the assistant project manager for the Cape Wind project. I joined that firm back in 2011. At the time, we were splitting up the project from a 2-contract structure to a 7-contract structure. So, you know, in the years that followed, I learned quite a bit about, you know, the capabilities of the U.S. supply chain. And, you know, at the time of my departure, our PPA had expired, but, you know, we had a suite of fully vetted, bankable construction contracts that used a sound mix of U.S. and European expertise. With some, you know, we were sort of approaching some key limitations that I'll address shortly. Luckily for me, there was another project underway further west in Southwest, which is the Block Island project, where I joined as the project manager for GE, then Alstom, the turbine supplier, in mid-2015. And over the first 4 months, set up and permitted and developed a local staging and assembly facility where we hired, you know, hundreds of local and European workers, and I oversaw tower assembly and load out installation and commissioning, which finished up in December of last year. So since then, I've been working as a consultant. Again, RCG, We're based in the UK with several offices around Europe, but I work out of our office in New York. And the things that I've been keeping busy with are the master plan in New York State. So that is the rollout of some additional sites to support New York's objective of procuring 2,400 megawatts of power from offshore wind by 2030. And I've also been working with a special initiative on offshore wind on a project which is on US oil and gas diversification into offshore wind. I'm actually down here in New Orleans at the Workboat Conference today and had some very productive discussions with US oil and gas companies last night about the topics that we'll go through today. So that's me. My hope for today is really kind of just to give you all a good understanding of the offshore wind supply chain, sort of, soup to nuts, and to look at opportunities based on market development, timing, and locations of economic activity, and then hopefully as a takeaway, not knowing who each of you represent, I'm hoping that various companies listening into this can identify opportunities that may work for their business. So this is sort of a overview of forecast, I think, for installed capacity between now and 2030. As Alan mentioned, there's kind of a low scenario and a high scenario. This shows sort of closer to the high scenario, which is based on an election that just occurred in New Jersey, where we expect that market to add about 3.5 gigawatts of cumulative capacity relatively quickly, since the legislation has already been enacted. So it's a bit of a slow curve over the next few years. We have some interesting projects sort of following on from Block Island, which I'll sort of get into later in the presentation. But, sort of overall here, what you're seeing is sort of a trend similar to the one that Alan showed in Europe, where, it's slow and steady to start. It's very challenging to start a kind of multi-billion-dollar industry on public lands in a new sort of regulatory environment. And it takes time for projects to get going and to get the expertise needed to get through permitting effectively and bring on capable partners. But we expect, by the mid 2020s, that major markets will have projects underway and things will start to take off. The way that I've sort of framed this presentation is using this kind of color scheme, a stoplight, if you will, where I show, in red, what's kind of a foreign supply chain element that really kind of needs to come from Europe currently. What is politically encouraged to come from local economies? So, basically in the US, states are almost like countries. They set their own procurement agendas, including offshore wind and other renewables. So in return for paying for, a higher price for offshore wind, they expect to see local economic development. And, here I just want to kind of show you what developers will likely try to do with local companies, or at least in local areas. And then green, the focus here is on products and services that can be provided by domestic companies, with an emphasis on, companies from the Gulf of Mexico that are currently working in oil and gas markets or other marine construction industries that, could kind of pivot to focus on offshore wind, or already have assets or can provide services to do so. So 101 offshore wind, this is what the developer buys in the image above. Alan mentioned turbines being a major component. The turbines sit on foundations. Foundations generally are either of a monopile or jacket foundation type. Monopile, designs these are very sort of thick-walled, large diameter tubes that really require some investment before fabricators are able to produce them. So many of the sort of key fabricators that are able to do this in sort of a large sort of serial production line are in Europe, and sort of a large pipeline of US projects using monopiles explicitly would be needed to support investment in monopile fabrication capabilities in the US. It's not that won't happen, but currently it's expected that monopiles would come from Europe. whereas jacket foundations, can be made and are made in the Gulf of Mexico for oil and gas purposes. The Block Island Wind Farm used 5 jacket foundations from Gulf Island fabricators down here in Louisiana. So, there's a mix there. Substations, again, very large, heavy, top size and jackets. Again, those can be made from oil and gas providers in the U.S. and in the Gulf. There's only a few facilities on the East Coast that can handle it. So it's expected that there will be some market for that here in the Gulf should those designs continue to be used. Array cable and export cable, like turbines, are going to come from Europe until there's a sufficient pipeline to support manufacturing. There is JDR, one of the array cable suppliers in Europe, is eyeing a manufacturing facility in Maryland in support of the market there. So that could change and swing to be something that is produced in the U.S. And then on the right-hand side, you see all of these sort of local construction aspects. So you've got crew transfer vessels. There's many marinas in the markets in the Northeast that can make those vessels. The upland transmission system, onshore substation, and any O&M facilities. Local New England or Mid-Atlantic contractors are expected to win those contracts. But what sort of I've shown below here are, again, highlighting in green because I think the Gulf can lend a lot of experience to this. All of the things that are kind of service-based, so vessels, cranes, and equipment, geophysical and geotechnical work that, again, is done widely in the Gulf for oil and gas purposes. We need those companies to come up and survey all of these sites as they're currently doing. And then there's a lot of sort of transportation and logistics know-how, people that work in ports that are familiar with lifting and assembly and manufacturing and stevedoring, et cetera. So this is a bit of a breakdown of offshore wind. Again, as I kind of talked about in the last slide, there's a lot of political interest in offshore wind. This is coming from state policy. So states and developers, kind of nod at each other about where jobs will be. Some states have even implemented net benefits requirements for procurement. So Maryland is an example of that. And I know that Massachusetts and New York are also evaluating bids on the amount of local content that they provide. So it really sort of starts with the public, the state government. They're trying to, get as much as they can for as low of a cost as possible. Developers in these various markets are trying to do things with the least costs, right? The easiest timeline to financing and permitting, and want to reduce risk by using experienced partners. Prime contractors, sort of a similar objective. They're trying to sort of do things in a way that makes them money, minimizes risk, and satisfies contract requirements. And then the trickle down is obviously to local suppliers and to labor, which is a key stakeholder with a lot of public influence. So, you have to be mindful that in New England markets in particular, union labor is something to consider as being a part of the project in all likelihood. On this next slide, I kind of just want to show you, I think you guys are looking at some warning there. Okay, I just want to show you, again, a really kind of a breakdown of that slide 2 slides ago that shows, what a U.S. offshore, or what an offshore wind farm is and what content can come from the U.S. So in the upper left-hand corner, you see key components that would be imported from Europe: monopiles, turbines currently, transition pieces, export, and array cable, so submarine cable. With a large enough pipeline of projects in the U.S., and we're sort of getting there, many European companies or even U.S. companies would potentially invest in the equipment and facilities needed to manufacture those types of goods domestically. But until that happens, really the bankable partners that can serially produce these components on time and in large quantities are based in Europe, providing these things to the European industry. And then you see these goods coming to a local staging area. So that would be, for example, the Port of New Bedford in Massachusetts, or recently, Provport in Rhode Island. And then there's other sites in Maryland and New York and in the Mid-Atlantic that are, politically preferred to support projects there. Those European components, right, that come to shore, they need to get offshore. So I'm showing you here the types of vessels that can be used in the interim to provide these goods out to a suitable heavy lift jackup installation vessel, which is really needed for turbines. As I show on the right here, derrick barges are able to receive, monopiles and transition pieces and certainly install jackets. So there's some ability for U.S. vessels or foreign flagged vessels that are used in the Gulf to support offshore installation, but currently turbine installation requires, a kind of a specialized design that doesn't exist if it weren't for the offshore wind business. So I show here kind of on the left, this Jones Act jackup vessel that's a question mark. Alan alluded to this. This is a complicated business case decision that that needs to be made. And right now, the challenge is that for turbines, you need to pick the components off of a stabilized platform. So I show turbines here on a lift boat. So for Block Island, we had 5 Montco lift boats from, two Montco lift boats from the Gulf, bringing the components of the 5 turbines out to a foreign flagged specialized turbine installation vessel. If the project were larger and further from shore, we would have needed a lot more lift boats, and it would cost quite a bit to outfit barges, each with jackup legs to do so. So you have to sort of weigh the pros and cons of spending a bunch of money, capitalizing the cost of all of these new jackup legs on a bunch of barges versus, basically just building a special purpose U.S. flagged jackup installation vessel. So, time will tell how that plays out. There's a great study that was done by Gusto MSc in support of the NYSERDA master plan that I encourage you all to read to understand the issues with this and the various designs that are under consideration. When it comes to cable installation, again, being that submarine and export and array cable is probably going to come from Europe for the near term, and these projects are in a sort of exposed mid-ocean environments with large significant wave heights and storms and whatnot. It makes sense for European or foreign flagged specialized cable installation vessels to be used to install those components. And they might as well just load them at their factories in Europe and mobilize over with the components already on them. But otherwise, they could, pick them up at the port in the U.S. Near shore, there is an option for, sort of a U.S. method of outfitting a barge with kind of a cable installation kit to install, probably export cable spliced within sort of a comfortable distance to shore. So there's companies that are still in the market for that and can support kind of near shore sheltered projects. But again, many of the projects in the Atlantic are further from shore than Cape Wind and Block Island and in conditions that wouldn't make that a real practical option. Looking sort of to the right hand corner here, there's a lot that is going to come from the Gulf in support of the industry. Topsides, for example, for offshore substations and jackets as well for those. Jacket foundations, again, we already have those capabilities here, and vessels. Any vessels that are built in support of the U.S. offshore wind market that are Jones Act compliant, are not going to come from New England. They're going to come from down south. And then I just sort of show over here, again, what I said earlier about upland transmission work being done by local companies and O&M type facilities and assets being built by local companies as well. So other things that are sort of domestic capabilities that are behind these sort of major components are here. So design, engineering, permitting, geophysical, geotechnical, subsea structure design, offshore project permitting, all of those capabilities exist in the U.S. So if that's what your company does and you're interested in the market, I think you have a good chance at competing. It's helpful to have an office in the state where your project is, but but otherwise you should have a seat at the table if you're capable. Vessels, barges, lift boats, as I mentioned. Tower internals, so for example, all of the guts that go inside turbines could come from the US, really just the main components, the nacelles and blades and tower tubes are currently expected to come from Europe. There's no reason why OEMs couldn't source electronics and other guts from US companies. Cable protection systems, concrete mattresses, scour protection, lifting equipment, cranes, electronics, ROVs, components that go on transition pieces, and then construction consumables, and then ultimately, manpower. We need U.S. Project management, safety management, training facilities, PPE, et cetera. So there's a lot that really happens behind the scenes that is overlooked, but a really important part of the U.S. offshore wind industry, and a relatively large opportunity for sort of suppliers further down the supply chain to really kind of market themselves as key providers of these services. So now looking at sort of geographic context here. I've mentioned Block Island and Cape Wind. Those are up here. There's the stars in red over here are ports. The circles I've drawn are sort of regions of economic activity. Again, this is state politics at play. And you see here that there's some really kind of key projects and key markets that are poised to take off in the near term. For example, there's a 90 megawatt project off of, well, it's technically off of Rhode Island, but it'll be interconnecting into New York, the LIPA project that already has a PPA with Long Island Power. There is a fierce competition right now for offtake in Massachusetts. Bids are due end of this year, and it's expected that one or more developers will have a contract for power sometime, Q1 or 2 next year. New York has a $43 million site here controlled by Statoil with at least 4 more sites on the way that they've selected as part of this master planning process. New Jersey just elected a governor that's sympathetic to offshore wind and is expected to pass legislation or reinstate legislation that creates a market of up to 3,500 megawatts. In Maryland, there are 2 projects that just received OREC awards, which is effectively a PPAs for offshore wind. And in Maryland's Sparrows Point, up here to the left, there's a big effort underway to sort of transform that vacant manufacturing facility into a offshore wind manufacturing hub. And each of these projects are bound by net benefit requirements that incentivize them to use local companies and local content. So there should be some great partnership and technology transfer opportunities in Sparrows Point in support of these projects. And then you also have an interesting development down here in Virginia where the utility there, Dominion, has hired Ørsted, formerly Dong Energy, as kind of an EPC contractor to build a 2-turbine project that is expected to get underway very quickly, really be built in 2019, I think is the plan. And there's a very large site behind that that could be opened up should the project go well and Dominion decide that it's worth pursuing offshore wind further. Further to the south, there's a site controlled by Iberdrola, Kitty Hawk in North Carolina. There's sort of yet to be a market there for offtake, but there's some activity also down in South Carolina where BOEM is sort of working to identify wind energy areas that could be potentially leased in the future once, I think there's more interest in the market there. So these are the kind of hubs and projects that we have. To give you a sense, though, of the timing of all of this, and I encourage you to, if you're interested in any of these projects or any of these areas, to really kind of get up to speed on where they are in the development process. There's sort of 2 paths, right, that developers need to follow. They need to get a power contract, then they need to get a site control, and then they need to get permits, engineering, and financing organized. So on the site control path, if you will, it's about a 5 to 7 year period between when a developer has control of the site and when they have done all of their geophysical and geotechnical work, and they've received all of their permits and have approval to start construction. So they should have, you know, offtake, you know, and other sort of financing and permitting that's not federal obtained along sort of a similar path. But, you know, sort of be warned that, you know, it may take many years until some of these opportunities materialize. But, you know, it's really sort of expected that given the wide variety of states and wide variety of political climates in those states that currently support offshore wind, that, you know, that this sort of competition for, you know, who goes first on the manufacturing end is going to sort of help projects get through permitting more easily. There's a rush in, you know, both Democratic and Republican states to get this done, and there's a lot of sort of major companies now, right, that have site control along the eastern seaboard. This isn't anymore, you know, local sort of independent developers. It's major European and international energy companies that are making significant investments in the U.S. So it should provide some comfort that this market should follow the path that, you know, we've laid out. So going back to this slide about, you know, clusters of economic activity and kind of what could happen there, you know, I've sort of broken this down again as I talked about, you know, 5 kind of key areas. On the right-hand side here, you know, these are the things that, again, encoded for red and green, should come from probably Europe in the near term, but also, you know, can be made in the Gulf. So, you know, secondary steel, tools and equipment, vessels, etc., jackets, topsides, tools, expertise. So there's a lot of ways that U.S. oil and gas can kind of get in the game here. There's, as I mentioned, a very charged political environment that's encouraging local economic development, but there's really no reason why, you know, companies can't join up with local companies and join up with European companies to have a seat at the table and to provide, you know, services, you know, at a lower cost that are reflecting requirements for, you know, U.S. codes and standards compliance and things like that. So just to kind of wrap things up quickly, I know we're running out of time. We have a massive pipeline now of projects in the U.S. And we're sort of nearing tipping points for key investments in manufacturing. Some of those, right, some of those supply chain components require, you know, this pipeline to be increased even further before investment takes place. So I'm talking about Jones Act vessels, monopiles, and turbines. And there's incentives to do this in places like Massachusetts, New York, and Maryland, but that could happen in the Gulf as well. There's some significant geographic and cost advantages to establishing, you know, really kind of local supply chains for certain components. Alan mentioned, you know, O&M, for example, subsea inspections, maintenance, all of that. And there's a lot of domestic supply chains that can support U.S. offshore wind and further investment and partnership opportunities. The winning recipe here is, you know, U.S. capabilities, European know-how and lessons learned, and, you know, a local labor force. That's really kind of what developers want to see, what politicians want to see, and what really is practical for the market. And lastly, you know, offshore wind is complicated, it's confusing, it's taken a lot of time here in the U.S. to get started. So it really requires that, you know, if you want to participate, you know, continue to pay attention, continue to network and to meet with people, and remain patient. You know, as the market develops, you know, developers will have different procurement strategies that will favor certain companies that will get certain contracts. If you can pay attention to that, you can, you know, network with the right people to be in the right place at the right time to win a contract. So this is my contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions about this or anything else. And thank you, Adam, for having me and for putting this all together.
Boone, thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation. I just have a few questions for you. So first up, how were Gulf and domestic companies involved in Block Island? Could you elaborate a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, in the case of that project, it's 5 turbines. There was no substation, and I mean Deepwater Wind, made an effort to try to bring in U.S. capabilities. So, Gulf Island was the fabricator of those jacket foundations. That made more economic sense than monopiles for that project. They used U.S. companies like Weeks Marine and Montco to install those jacket foundations. They used Montco to provide feeder vessels for the turbines. Again, I think we need a lot more of those, or we need a jack-up Jones Act flag vessel for future projects. And they really made a lot of use of, Gulf experience kind of on the ground, or at least we did with GE, hiring guys that had worked in ports in Texas and Louisiana to come up to Rhode Island for a couple years and really kind of run our yards. So there's a lot of ways that we brought in Gulf experience, and I think with a larger project, which all future projects are really expected to be, except for Virginia, we can really kind of get a lot more involvement in folks from down south.
Okay, and I've seen a lot of people have been asking, can you just quickly explain what the issue is with the Jones Act? Some of the listeners don't actually know what that is. So could you just tell us quickly what that means?
Yeah. So the Jones Act is called the Merchant Maritime Act, I think, in 1920, and the law was put in place to protect the U.S. shipping industry from foreign shipyards. So basically, what it requires is that goods that are merchandise that is transported between U.S. ports or U.S. points, and an offshore wind foundation is considered that. They need to be transported on U.S. flagged, owned, and operated vessels. So it needs to be, more than 50% content in terms of the cost, more than 50% in terms of the ownership, and the crew needs to be more than 50% American. And I may be off on the details there, but that's the gist of it. So for components, right, that we currently have to import from Europe and stick in a local staging area, we can't then take them offshore unless we're using a Jones Act vessel. So it needs to be a U.S. flag vessel that takes the goods from the port to the offshore site. Now, we can use European vessels offshore, but they can't move with any components on their deck, because then they're considered to be carrying merchandise. So in the case of Block Island, we mobilized the nacelles already on the installation vessel from Europe to the U.S. Then the nacelles basically sat there, and the vessel would jack up and receive the tower components from shore on Jones Act vessels, and it would sort of act as a stationary crane, or it would just pick up the components off of the Jones Act vessels and just set them in place, not carrying them in between ports. It doesn't apply to cable, but it is a bit of a complicated dance to get through, especially with, when you consider tools and things like tower hats and other types of equipment. So it's something to be mindful of, and definitely a key cost driver and sort of chicken and egg challenge to development.
And when would we expect to see the first U.S. flagged wind turbine installation vessel ready?
I would expect, no sooner than mid-2020s. Again, if that's the case, I encourage you to read the Gusto MSc study on this. I'm sure you can find it online, or email me and I can send it to you. But the challenge with building a Jones Act vessel is, as we've seen in Europe, right, technology has continued to advance. Turbines keep getting bigger and bigger. So what was once a really great idea to build a jack-up vessel that can hold 6 megawatt turbines, like wow, is now no longer that useful with future projects. So day rates have sort of come down for sort of I want to call them like tier 2 and tier 3 jack-up installation vessels in Europe, making them pretty attractive to use in the U.S., again, provided that it makes sense to outfit a suite of barges to provide the turbine components to them. So in the U.S., people are very wary of, okay, if I build a $200, $300 million jack-up vessel to carry things between the port and site, what am I going to build it for? Is it a 10 megawatt turbine? That may be obsolete. And in 20 years or so, when I still need to be, maybe paying back the debt on the vessel, maybe we'll have floating foundations and not need these vessels at all. So any Jones Act vessel that gets built, right, needs to be de-risked from a market perspective. It needs to be able to serve European and Asian markets, be cost competitive with vessels there probably, and probably also be useful in the U.S. for oil and gas work. So it's a bit of a challenge, but I know that there's a lot of companies that are looking into this, and I encourage you to talk to one of the big vessel companies and get their take on this.
Okay, thanks. And just a couple more questions, Boone. You mentioned something about monopiles earlier and that they would be sourced from Europe. Why is that, and can they be built in the US?
They can. The person to talk to about that is Tim Mack at EEW. But basically, as I said earlier, monopiles are very thick steel-walled, cylinders, and the rolling equipment is expensive, and the handling equipment. It would cost about $100 million to set up a monopile rolling setup, just the equipment alone, not the facility, in the U.S. So, projects in the U.S., if you look at their water depths, sort of further down south, monopiles are probably going to be used if it makes sense to do so. Whereas, there's options for jackets and other types of foundations, kind of in New York and in the Northeast, where the water depths are, approaching kind of 50 meters or so. And XL monopiles would be particularly hard for U.S. ports and vessels to handle. So, yeah, that's really kind of the reason. You need to have a large enough market to bring that equipment over here and invest in those capabilities.
Okay. And my final question is, what can companies do in the next 12 months to set themselves up to be ready to take on work in the U.S. offshore wind industry as those projects come through?
Well, I would really again, as Alan said, come to the conferences if you can, or, talk to as many people as you can, but really focus on when companies get offtake. So right now, there's 2 companies in Maryland that have offtake. They're in construction planning. They should be in the next year, thinking about where they're going to buy stuff. Massachusetts, there'll be 1 or more developers there that'll be building, between 2 and 800 megawatt projects. So they'll be looking to buy things there. They should have an installation strategy, and from whoever sort of gets in the door there, they'll need subcontractors and et cetera. So kind of follow the money if you can, and stay in tune with market developments. Again, it's changing all the time, but there's a wide variety of projects and a wide variety of kind of technical requirements that need to be satisfied by different types of companies that should result in there being kind of a lot of different companies that can find niche opportunities that work.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Boone, thank you so much for your time today and for the presentation. It was really great. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Okay, goodbye. Now, just before I tie up the webinar, just to let you know that you will have access to the full audio replay and presentation slides. And feel free to share those with your colleagues and peers when you receive those. So from Alan and Boone, we've seen that there's a huge opportunity presented by the US offshore wind industry, and I'd like all of you, if you can, to come and join us at the US Offshore Wind Conference in Boston on June the 7th and the 8th. We've got a dedicated track for how to diversify and transition into the US offshore wind supply chain, going over all of the opportunities there and what you need to do to take advantage of that. So please do join us. If you register now, you can get a $300 super early bird discount. So get registered, because the event will probably sell out quite well in advance. So do check out our website. It's newenergyupdates.com/offshore-USA. And I've added the brochure to the handouts on this webinar, so you can quickly take a look at that. So that's all we have time for. Thank you very much. Thanks to Alan and Robert for speaking today, and I'll hopefully see you in Boston. Thank you very much.